Hollywood loves to show us knights. The glint of armor, noble tournaments, the whispers of courtly ladies to whom he pledges eternal devotion. Deeply ingrained in our minds is the image of this valiant, exclusively heterosexual protector whose honor is his shield and whose sword is an extension of his righteous hand. We envision valiant warriors whose love for a woman is the cornerstone of their existence, unbreakable and pure. But what if I told you that this image is merely a thin gilding on a rusty medieval blade? What if behind this facade lies a reality so foreign and unsettling to our modern eyes that it could shatter your preconceived notions about the Middle Ages into dust? Can you feel the comfortable world of chivalric romances starting to crack at the seams? Because medieval sexuality wasn't about gender, it was about power, dominance, and survival. For the Romans, whose legacy permeated the European Middle Ages, being gay referred to an act, not an identity. The passive role was shameful, but the desire itself was simply part of human nature. Marriage was a political arrangement, not a romantic union. It was an era when the boundaries of sexual relationships were far more fluid and dictated by hierarchy, rather than by who you shared a bed with. This turns everything you thought you knew on its head. And today, we'll embark on a journey to snatch from the clutches of myth the true, inconvenient truth about knights and sexuality. We'll see how the Romans categorized desires, how the church blessed what today seems unthinkable, and how kings lost their thrones because of forbidden love. Prepare yourselves, because your night will never be the same. But to truly understand how this flexibility manifested, we need to look into the most unexpected corners of history. For example, the bedrooms of Roman emperors. We've discussed the fluidity of medieval sexuality, how it wasn't about gender, but about power. And to truly see this reality for what it was, we'll have to transport ourselves to a place where power was absolute and norms were entirely different. Forget about romance. Prepare for a shock. The myth we're about to debunk goes like this. Roman emperors, such as Nero, engaged in sexual practices that the modern world would label as homosexual, but for Romans, it was a matter of dominance and status, not gender identity. Do you think gay emperors is a modern label we've retroactively applied to history? Think again. Of course, we're used to imagining valiant Roman men who valued their pudicitia, their sexual purity, and the image of a dominant, unwavering man was the ideal that every citizen, especially an emperor, was expected to embody. Their strength lay in their control, in their ability to lead, not to be led. But imagine a completely different scene. You're standing in a luxurious hall of an imperial palace, bathed in the light of golden lamps. The air is heavy with the scent of exotic incense, wine, and roasted meat. At a banquet, amidst laughter and music, Emperor Nero, adorned in a wedding veil just like a bride, assumes the role of wife in a marriage to one of his favorites, Pythagoras. Later, he marries the eunuch Sporus, who bears a striking resemblance to his deceased wife and openly calls him his empress. You feel a shiver of shock and outrage run down your spine, but this isn't the outrage you'd expect. It's not outrage about a same-sex relationship itself. It's something far deeper, undermining the very foundation of Roman society. So what exactly is going on here? Why was the Senate, accustomed to the whims of emperors, furious? The answer lies in the Roman system of values, which completely overturns our modern understanding of sexuality. For the Romans, sexuality wasn't categorized by gender. The modern concepts of homosexual or heterosexual simply didn't exist. Instead, it was all about a dichotomy, active versus passive, dominant versus submissive. A man who engaged in sexual relations with another man wasn't considered gay as long as he maintained the active dominant role. He preserved his masculinity and status. But to take on a passive role, to submit, that was the ultimate disgrace, a profound display of weakness, utterly unworthy of a man, much less an emperor. Nero, by donning a wedding veil, didn't just violate social norms, he openly embraced a humiliating feminine role, thereby undermining his dignitas, his dignity and authority as a ruler. He effectively stripped himself of the status of a dominant man, which to the Romans was tantamount to political suicide. This is not a question of gender identity, it's a question of power and control turned on its head. Emperor Nero married two men and assumed the role of a submissive wife, which shocked the Senate by violating Roman norms of dominance, rather than those of gender dichotomy. And it was this that truly caused the outrage. But if Roman emperors could so challenge the norms of dominance, even at the cost of their own status, then what was happening when the church itself, the very pillar of morality, encouraged unions that today we would call gay marriages? We've just seen how Roman emperors juggled the concepts of dominance and passivity, challenging norms that we consider unshakable. But what if I told you that even the church itself, which we've grown accustomed to seeing as a bastion of the strictest morality, was, up to a certain point, far more flexible? The myth we're about to debunk states that the medieval church, contrary to modern belief, did not always condemn same-sex relationships, and at times even sanctioned fraternal unions that functionally resembled marriages, especially before the 14th century. Forget the sin of Sodom, the burning stakes, and instant damnation. Certainly, we are accustomed to picturing the Middle Ages as a period of absolute religious intolerance where any unnatural act was met with immediate and brutal punishment. This image is deeply ingrained in our minds, shaped by centuries of propaganda and oversimplification. Yet, for a significant period, the Church viewed this quite differently. Imagine a dimly lit church, its air thick with the scent of incense and old damp stone. You hear the muffled echo of footsteps and the rustle of garments. You see two men, perhaps young knights or merchants, standing before the altar. Their right hands are joined in a firm clasp, and the priest, standing before them, recites the very same prayers used for a marriage between a man and a woman. He blesses their union, their bond, their mutual devotion. Then the curtain comes down, and they share a kiss that leaves no doubt about their genuine feelings. This is not a dream, not a Hollywood fabrication, and not merely friendship as we understand it today. This is a fraternal union, adelpha poiesis, and the church blesses it. You can feel the history you thought you knew beginning to crumble. What you've just pictured isn't the result of some twisted fantasy. It's a deeply ingrained, though long forgotten practice. And to understand why something like this was even possible, we need to dig much deeper than just the superficial ideas we have about medieval morality. The reason these brotherhoods were not just tolerated, but institutionalized lies in a fundamentally different attitude towards sexuality. Before the 11th century, so-called homosexuality was not considered a serious crime in the same sense as heresy or murder. Penances for such sins were remarkably lenient, often consisting of a short fast or prayer, which stands in stark contrast to the ferocity with which sodomy was punished later. Sodomy itself was an extremely broad term, encompassing any non-procreative sexual acts: masturbation, coitus interruptus, withdrawal, oral sex, and even overly passionate heterosexual sex rather than just same-sex relations. Brotherhood unions, adelpha poiesis, were widespread in the Eastern and Western churches up until the 13th century. These rituals, preserved in numerous manuscripts, included prayers, the laying on of hands, shared communion, and even a betrothal ceremony that was virtually identical to marriage ceremonies between a man and a woman. They were meant to solidify a deep bond between two individuals, ensuring mutual support, loyalty, and even inheritance, which, in a world where families often perished from disease or war, was vitally important. These unions provided social and sometimes spiritual recognition to relationships that transcended mere friendship, offering protection and stability in an unpredictable world. Thus, prior to the 14th century, the Church not only did not persecute same-sex relationships with the same ferocity it would later, but also actively offered institutional forms for their recognition. This directly contradicts the myth of pervasive homophobia and a monolithic, unchanging morality in the Middle Ages. But this remarkable tolerance, this flexibility unimaginable to us, could not last forever. Once the concepts of sin and heresy became powerful political weapons, when the hunger for power and land clashed with these fraternal bonds, the cost proved deadly, and no one paid it as dearly as the Knights Templar, whose fate became a sinister harbinger of a new era. But this astonishing tolerance, this flexibility we can hardly imagine, could not last forever. Once the concepts of sin and heresy became powerful political weapons, when the hunger for power and land collided with these fraternal bonds, the price proved deadly, and no one paid a higher price than the Knights Templar, whose fate became an ominous harbinger of a new era. And so, we've arrived at the point where sin is no longer merely a question of spiritual purity, but transforms into a deadly political weapon. The myth we're about to debunk goes like this. The accusations of sodomy leveled against the Knights Templar were not so much a reflection of their actual sexual practices, but rather a powerful political weapon used to bring about their destruction. Forget about the Holy Grail, about mystical secrets and noble purposes. The true secret of the Templars isn't what they hid, but what was attributed to them. Of course, the Knights Templar, these elite warriors of the Crusades, were a symbol of piety and military valor. Their code of honor, their vows, demanded the strictest chastity, loyalty, and asceticism. They were the living embodiment of Christian ideals, defenders of the Holy Land, and this is exactly the image we've grown accustomed to seeing in movies and books. But imagine this radiant image shattering against the walls of a dark, damp dungeon. You stand in this gruesome place. The air hangs thick with the stench of fear, urine, and congealed blood. Muffled, yet piercing screams echo off the stone walls. Before you is a Knight Templar, his once proud face bruised, his body beaten beyond recognition. He collapses to his knees, the torture continues. He is forced to confess to heresy, idol worship, and renouncing Christ. He breaks, he confesses. But when the Inquisitor demands a confession to unholy kisses and sodomy, to unnatural acts with other men, he refuses. Even as pain pierces him to the bone and every nerve screams for mercy, he stands his ground. This isn't just torture for the truth. It's an attempt to break his spirit, to force him to betray not only his order, but also his forbidden love, or, even more importantly, his honor in the eyes of his tormentors. This desperate refusal, uttered by weary lips, reveals the full depth of cynicism hidden behind the accusations. This is not merely a moral judgment, it is a political one. So, what happened? Why did accusations of sodomy become such a powerful weapon? The answer lies in a radical shift in attitudes towards sexuality that occurred within the church by the 14th century. While previously, as we've seen, sodomy was a broad term encompassing many non-procreative acts and not always punished with extreme severity, it now transformed into one of the most serious crimes, punishable exclusively by death. This was the result of a deliberate campaign to tighten moral standards, which turned any unnatural act into a mortal sin. It was this new, harsher interpretation of sodomy that proved to be the perfect weapon in the hands of French King Philip IV the Fair. His goal was simple: to destroy the powerful Knights Templar, whose wealth, military might, and independence had become an unbearable threat to him. He couldn't simply declare them enemies of the crown. He needed a legitimate, divinely sanctioned reason for their total annihilation, one that would justify the confiscation of their property and the killing of thousands of people. Therefore, he accused them of everything: of heresy, of renouncing Christ, of idol worship, and of course of sodomy. Significantly, many Templars, under inhumane torture, confessed to heresy and blasphemy, actions that could be interpreted as a momentary weakness or a lapse in judgment in the face of such suffering. But it was the accusations of sodomy that they most frequently denied. Why? Because it wasn't merely a sin, it was an act that, in the eyes of society at the time, completely stripped a person of their honor and dignity, making them an outcast and condemning them to oblivion. This suggests that for many of them, even under the threat of death, confessing to sexual crimes against nature was worse than admitting to heresy. The accusations of sodomy were not so much an investigation into their actual sexual practices as they were a powerful instrument of political propaganda, designed to demonize the order and justify its complete annihilation in the eyes of the entire Christian world. Accusations of sodomy were such a powerful tool of political propaganda that they could destroy an entire order of knights, regardless of the actual practices, demonstrating how sin was used for control and power rather than for upholding true morality. But if entire orders could be brought down due to rumors and political machinations, what then of kings? those who should have been the very embodiment of manhood and order, but whose personal affections proved to be their undoing. But if entire orders could be brought down by rumors and political intrigue, what then of kings? Those who should have been the very embodiment of manhood and order, yet whose personal affections ultimately became their undoing. We've come to a moment when the personal becomes deadly political. When love, the very thing we've come to romanticize, transforms into the most dangerous weapon. The myth we're about to debunk goes like this. English kings, Edward II and Richard II, were overthrown and killed not only for political reasons, but also because their open homoerotic relationships with favorites undermined their masculinity and were perceived as a threat to the state. Behind every great king stands a favorite whose love could cost him his crown. Of course, we're used to imagining a medieval monarch as the embodiment of strength, wisdom, and dynastic succession. The image of an ideal ruler demanded that personal affections be subservient to state interests, and his masculinity be undisputed and unquestionable. Otherwise, the entire system would collapse. He had to be the father of the nation, a model of piety and stability. But you stand in the royal hall, where the air is thick with tension, as dense as an autumn fog. King Edward II, just returned from France, instead of rushing to his new young wife, the French Princess Isabella, pointedly ignores her. His eyes and steps are drawn to another man, his favorite, Piers Gaveston. The king embraces him, kisses him, and you feel a wave of outrage sweep through the hall, palpable, almost physical. This is not merely undiplomatic. It's not merely a breach of etiquette. It's a challenge that feels like a slap in the face to everyone present, especially the Queen, and which calls into question the king's very legitimacy. That surge of passion and animosity you just experienced was no accident. It was a direct blow to the very foundations of medieval power, and its true reason lies in how royal sexuality was perceived and used. The reason these relationships were so destructive was not just about envy or jealousy. The thing is, a medieval ruler's masculinity was inextricably linked to his ability to dominate, produce legitimate heirs, and maintain order. An excessive attachment to a male favorite, especially when displayed publicly and leading to the distribution of lands and titles, undermined these foundations. Edward II and his favorites, first Piers Gaveston and then Hugh Despenser the Younger, displayed an excessive love that was perceived by the aristocracy not as a personal choice, but as a weakness, a dereliction of his royal duties. A king who allowed himself to be led by another man could not be a strong leader, and this jeopardized the state. Unsurprisingly, Edward II was eventually overthrown. His death became one of history's most gruesome and symbolic acts of retribution. He was murdered with a red-hot poker in the anus. This wasn't mere cruelty. It was a carefully orchestrated symbolic punishment for sodomy designed to forever tarnish his memory and serve as a stark warning to anyone who dared defy the natural order. A similar fate also awaited Richard II. While his relationships with favorites, such as Robert de Vere, may not have been as overtly erotic, homoerotic rumors and accusations of improper affection were actively exploited by his enemies to discredit him and undermine his authority, ultimately leading to his overthrow and death. In medieval England, homoerotic relationships between kings and their favorites were not simply condemned, but actively exploited as a potent weapon for their downfall, demonstrating that a ruler's masculinity was inextricably linked to his proper sexuality, and any deviation could cost him his crown and his life. So, we see the myth of the heroic knight crumble to dust, revealing a world where sexuality was a battlefield for power. But what if, even in the most romanticized tales of valiant knights, in the legends of Arthur and his Round Table, there were hints of that very forbidden love which was so fiercely persecuted and for which such a brutal price was paid? So, we see the myth of the heroic knight crumble to dust, revealing a world where sexuality was a battleground for power. But what if, even in the most romanticized stories of valiant knights, in the legends of Arthur and his Round Table, there were hints of that very forbidden love so fiercely persecuted and so ruthlessly paid for? We're drawing closer to the very heart of the myth, its epicenter, to where everything seemed crystal clear and heroically straightforward. Yet even here, an uncomfortable truth awaits us. The myth we're about to debunk goes like this. Even in classic Arthurian legends, such as Lancelot in prose and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there are homoerotic undertones and brotherly bonds that go beyond platonic friendship, challenging the myth of an exclusively heterosexual knighthood. King Arthur, Lancelot, Gawain. These names are synonymous with honor, valor, and of course the adoration of a fair lady. We grew up on stories of the Knights of the Round Table, where every heroic deed was dedicated to a lady love, and valor and honor were inextricably linked to this heterosexual love. We picture them, these knights in shining armor, ready for battle for their queen, for their beloved, for the very idea of romantic love. This ideal still shapes our understanding of medieval masculinity. But imagine a completely different scene, where those ideals begin to dim. You're sitting by the fireplace in Bertilac's castle, the air thick with the scent of smoldering logs and fresh game from the hunt. You're watching an unusual game, a ritual that appears friendly, yet conceals something far deeper. Lord Bertilac returns from the hunt, and Sir Gawain, as per their agreement, embraces and kisses him, once, then again, and again. 3 kisses. You feel an awkwardness, but also something more, a tension, a hidden desire that permeates this friendly exchange. This isn't just a ritual, it's a dance on the very edge of propriety, where each kiss carries a double, almost erotic meaning. This image that just appeared before your eyes is no accident and no mistake. It holds the key to understanding how deeply homoerotic motifs were woven into the very fabric of medieval literature, even in those works we consider pillars of heterosexual romance. The reason these brotherly bonds transcend mere friendship is that medieval authors, whether subconsciously or intentionally, explored facets of human relationships that didn't fit within the narrow confines of procreative sexuality. For instance, in the monumental Lancelot in prose cycle, Lancelot Graal, which formed the basis for many Arthurian legends, the relationship between Lancelot and Galahad clearly goes beyond simple camaraderie. Galahad, a powerful king, sacrifices his power and his kingdom for Lancelot. He literally dies of grief when Lancelot forsakes their bond for Guinevere. And Lancelot, in turn, expresses a desire to be buried beside him, which in that era was the ultimate expression of intimate affection. This is not mere friendship. It is a deep, selfless, and tragic love that drives the plot no less than his relationship with Queen Guinevere. Similarly, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Gawain's kisses with Lady Bertilac, which he then passes on to her husband, Lord Bertilac, carry a clear, carefully veiled erotic undertone. This is more than just a game. It's a test of loyalty and masculinity, where the line between courtesy and seduction is dangerously blurred. Furthermore, in some texts, such as Marie de France's L'Enval, accusations of incivility or lack of interest in women were not merely insults but indirect yet powerful attacks on a knight's masculinity, hinting at his unnatural inclinations, which could undermine his status and honor. These examples demonstrate how even in seemingly heterosexually oriented works, deep and passionate same-sex connections not only existed, but also formed central plotlines, though they were often disguised. This is precisely why the most renowned chivalric romances, which we consider the epitome of heterosexual valor, are actually teeming with hidden homoerotic desires and relationships that challenge our modern stereotypes about the Middle Ages and force us to rethink everything we thought we knew about that era. So, we've come a long way from romanticized illusions to the uncomfortable truth. We've seen how sexuality became a battleground for power, how it was used to overthrow kings and destroy orders. But what does this mean for us today as we look at history through the lens of our own biases? What are we missing when we refuse to see the full complexity and many dimensions of medieval life? So, we've come a long way from romanticized illusions to the uncomfortable truth. We've seen how sexuality was a battleground for power, how it was used to overthrow kings and destroy orders. But what does this mean for us today as we look at history through the lens of our own biases? What are we missing when we refuse to see the full complexity and many facets of medieval life? We began with an image, that quintessential knight in shining armor, valiant, courageous, and exclusively heterosexual protector of women, whose loyalty and love were directed solely toward a woman. It was an idealized portrayal, one that left no room for anything that might tarnish his impeccable reputation or call into question his proper affections. This myth, forged over centuries of romantic legends and Hollywood blockbusters, became deeply ingrained in our minds, creating a comforting yet deceptive version of the past. But forget about him. Forget the knight that fairy tales painted, because that image is just a facade hiding a much more complex, brutal, and, dare I say, human reality. You thought you knew the Middle Ages? You were wrong. Of course, we tend to only see in history what confirms our modern ideas of morality and sexuality. We like to believe that the past was either absolutely pure and pious, or absolutely sinful by our standards, but always simple and straightforward. But that's a simplification that diminishes our understanding and prevents us from seeing the true nature of human relationships. Recall the gleam of armor, the whispers of courtiers that you felt at the very beginning of our journey. But now you see something else behind this facade. You see not only valor and honor, but also hidden desires, political intrigues, personal tragedies, and unusual alliances that shape the world of knights far more profoundly than we ever imagined. You feel as the age-old dust and cobwebs of myths crumble away, revealing a fresh but uncomfortable truth. This isn't just a change of scenery, it's a complete reevaluation. And to understand how this happened, we need to piece together all the fragments we've uncovered, revealing the true landscape of medieval sexuality. We started with ancient Rome, where Emperor Nero, clad in a wedding veil, shocked the Senate not by a same-sex marriage, but by adopting a passive, feminine role, thereby violating the fundamental Roman dichotomy of dominance and submission. Sexuality there wasn't about gender, it was about power. Then we delved into the Middle Ages and found that the Church, which we often consider irreconcilable with sodomy until the 13th or 14th centuries, actually blessed brotherly unions, adelphopoiesis. These rituals, almost identical to heterosexual marriages, demonstrate that attitudes towards same-sex relationships were far more flexible and pragmatic than we might imagine. The term sodomy itself was extremely broad, encompassing a multitude of non-procreative acts, and was not always punished as severely as it would be later. But then, a turning point arrived. Remember the smell of fear and blood in the dark dungeons where the Knights Templar were tortured? They were accused of sodomy, not due to actual practices, but because it became a powerful political weapon. It was a way to destroy a powerful order, justify the confiscation of their wealth, and demonize the enemy in the eyes of the people and the church. Similarly, the excessive love of English kings such as Edward II for their favorites wasn't merely condemned, it undermined their manhood and was perceived as a direct threat to the state, leading to their overthrow and death. Sexuality became a battlefield for crowns and empires where personal attachments could be interpreted as treason. These stories are more than just dry facts. They reveal how intricately the personal and the political were intertwined, how norms changed, and how the concepts of sin and virtue were interpreted depending on who held power. Even in the most romanticized Arthurian legends, we found these forbidden undertones. Consider the deep, devoted bond between Lancelot and Galahad, where one dies of grief when the other turns away from him. Or Gawain's friendly kisses with Lord Bertilac, which carried something more than simple courtesy. These subtexts tell us that homoerotic desires and connections were part of chivalric culture, though often veiled or suppressed. The history of sexuality in the Middle Ages was far more complex, diverse, and politically charged than romanticized myths, and our modern perceptions of it are often just a projection of our own prejudices. That's precisely why it's so crucial to confront these uncomfortable truths. Because when we oversimplify history, when we gloss over its many dimensions, we're not merely fooling ourselves. We deprive ourselves of the ability to understand how societal norms take shape, how attitudes towards sexuality evolve, and how sin can be wielded as a tool of power to control people. Can you feel how these ancient stories resonate with modernity? How the same mechanisms of manipulation and judgment, merely repackaged, are still at play? Recognizing this complexity allows us to be more critical of today's narratives, of the ideals imposed upon us, and of how easily history can be distorted to serve the current agenda. This empowers you not just to passively consume information, but to see beyond the facade, to ask questions, and to seek the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Recall once more that night we started with: the gleam of his armor, the noble tournaments, the whispers of courtly ladies. But now you look at him differently. You see not just a figure from a fairy tale, but a complex individual, surrounded by a world where sexuality was a battlefield for power, where love could be a death sentence, where the church blessed what it would later condemn, and where masculinity was a fragile construct, constantly put to the test. His armor doesn't seem quite so gleaming now, and his noble vows aren't quite so clear-cut. He is no longer merely a heroic symbol. He is a man, a prisoner of his era, of his desires, and of those who sought to control his body and spirit.